Hello, everyone. This is not just a story. This is a memory someone might be living right now. If this touches you, please like the video and subscribe. Share your city and the hour you're watching this. Let's remind each other we are not invisible. Now turn off the lights, find a quiet space, and let's begin. I was arranging flowers in the sunroom when I heard them whispers, not meant for me, but loud enough to wound. The voices filtered through the old wooden panels like wind through a cracked window. Harsh, careless, familiar. She's nothing but a gold digger, a parasite, 68 and still clawing for money. I froze mid-snip garden scissors hovering above a fragile stem. Victoria's voice. Clipped cold and curled in judgment like always. She was speaking to Alexander. I could tell by the stiffness in her tone he brought out a sharper edge in her, and she wielded it with precision. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The petals in my hand trembled more than I did. She moved into our mother's house, Alexander replied, pretending she belongs, as if the linen curtains she's hung or the lavender she plants makes this hers. I don't care how kind she acts, she'll get nothing. The prenup is airtight, and when Dad's gone, she'll be back to whatever modest little life she came from. They laughed softly then, a shared joke at my expense. I wondered if they realized the floor carried sound, or perhaps they didn't care. Perhaps they thought I had no spine left after 3 years of subtle insults and 2 polite corrections. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I placed the stem down gently and smoothed the linen apron across my lap, the same one Charles had given me last spring on our anniversary, embroidered with my initials in a thread the color of dusk. They didn't know me. They thought I was some woman clinging to their father for security, for a name, for a legacy, not hers. They saw my age and my silence and mistook it for desperation. But silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's strategy. I carried the finished arrangement, peonies Charles's favorite, into the formal living room and placed it where the sun cut through the windows. The room smelled like polish and old wealth. It wore its age proudly like a coat, tailored for someone long dead. Catherine, the youngest, once told me this table had been in the family for 200 years. A legacy, an heirloom, a line in the sand. She'd said it kindly, I think, or at least she'd tried, but kindness laced with condescension cuts just as deep. I never told her that I had nearly identical pieces in storage in Boston furniture, carved by hands older than this house, older than their name. The clock in the hall chimed noon. I closed my eyes, breathing in the quiet. Charles would be home soon. He didn't know they were here. They hadn't told him. He still thought we were a family trying to love each other. That time would smooth what years of grief and resentment had roughened. He didn't hear what I heard. He didn't see how they looked at me when he wasn't watching. But I saw, I always saw. When the front door opened and his familiar voice called out warmth, returned to the space like sunlight creeping in after a long storm. "Margaret, are you home, my dear?" I met him in the hallway, smiled as he kissed my cheek. "I am. Your children are here." His brow furrowed just slightly. Enough. They didn't say they were coming. They're in the dining room, discussing business. He held my gaze, then his hand resting lightly over mine. Business. I didn't say anything more. I didn't need to. He knew. We ate lunch in the breakfast nook, just the two of us. Sandwiches and tea. The kind of meal that would have been ordinary once, but now felt sacred in its simplicity. He talked about the Singapore deal and his vineyard. I nodded, smiled in the right places. But my mind replayed Victoria's voice. Ironclad prenup, a woman who doesn't belong. When she entered the kitchen mid-bite, I wasn't surprised, only tired. "Daddy," she said, ignoring me completely. "We need to talk. It's urgent." Charles didn't flinch. He just smiled. After lunch. But after lunch, Victoria. She tightened her jaw, glanced at me with that familiar frost. "This is a family matter." I finally looked up. My voice was soft, deliberate. "I was thinking of redecorating the East Wing. Would you help, Victoria? I know how much this house means to you." Her eyes narrowed. I could see her calculating. "It was designed by my mother. It doesn't need changing." I smiled. Change can be difficult, but sometimes when you peel back the wallpaper, you find something unexpected beneath. maybe even something stronger. A flicker of something past her face. Confusion, maybe, or fear. Then it was gone. She left. Charles exhaled gently, frustrated. They don't see you, but I do. I touched his hand. That's why I stayed quiet, but things are changing, Charles. I think they need to know who I really am. He looked at me, then eyes searching. What are you saying? I'll tell you, but not now. There's still time. Later, as I washed our dishes, the quiet returned. But it wasn't empty. It was charged. This was the moment the story began to bend. Not with fury, not with confrontation, but with a silent folding of hands, a stillness that speaks louder than shouting. I wiped the porcelain dry and walked to the library. To make a phone call to the one man in this city who knew exactly who I was, who I had been before I was ever Margaret Hamilton. Because the petals were falling now, and I was no longer content to just arrange the flowers. It was time to rearrange the room and remind them I didn't marry into their world. I had one of my own, and it was far, far bigger. They never asked where I came from. Not once in 3 years did Victoria or Alexander show any curiosity about my life before Charles. Catherine had asked once softly over tea on the back patio when the magnolia trees were in bloom. "What did you do before you met my father?" she'd said, like someone reaching across a chasm too wide to shout across. I remember smiling. I grew flowers, I told her, which was true. I had. Just not the kind she imagined. My days had become simple since marrying Charles. Mornings began with sun and silence, the light slanting across the old floorboards of the sunroom like memory itself. I'd make tea from loose leaves, stored in a tin that had once belonged to my grandmother. My hands always steady folded napkins into clean corners and watered the roses I had transplanted from the nursery. It was a gentle life, and I had loved it. Loved the absence of press releases, quarterly reports, boardroom battles. After a lifetime spent navigating the rough seas of global trade, this quiet harbor was what I had needed. But now, after what I'd heard, I realized I had mistaken peace for progress. Every corner of this house held a breath of Elizabeth Hamilton, her portraits tasteful and pale, her scent still in the cedar closets, her recipes preserved in flour-dusted cards tucked inside the kitchen drawer. I had never tried to replace her, only to exist beside the memory she left behind. But they didn't see it that way. To them, I was the woman who dared to sit where their mother once sat, who dared to smile to host dinner parties to tend the same roses. They never noticed I never sat at the head of the table, never once corrected them when they mentioned Mother's garden, never touched Elizabeth's music box on the mantel. They mistook my restraint for weakness. But there's a certain strength in restraint, a power in choosing not to assert, especially when you could. Sometimes I'd walk through the East Wing in the early mornings, barefoot, a cup of chamomile in hand. The silence there was different, heavier. The light fell colder through the windows. The curtains were stiff, untouched. I'd never changed a thing, not out of reverence, but out of a quiet question I kept asking myself, when does honoring the past become living inside of it? Charles, for all his charm, was a man pulled in many directions, a father who still felt responsible, a husband trying to balance legacies. He didn't know the weight I carried every time I declined to attend family-only meetings or volunteered to take tea elsewhere when Victoria hosted guests. He thought I was being gracious, and maybe I was. But it's easy to be gracious when you've already had your turn at power. They didn't know that. They saw me in simple dresses, folding linens, pruning roses, and assumed I had bloomed late an accidental flower in an overgrown garden. But I had bloomed long before. Years ago in boardrooms with glass ceilings, I cracked quietly. At charity galas where I signed checks anonymously. At funerals where I gave eulogies that didn't mention wealth but carried the weight of it. And before all of that, when I was 22 and newly married to Michael Sullivan, we had shared a 2-room apartment with threadbare rugs and a teapot that whistled louder than it boiled. We built everything together. Michael had vision. I had execution. He made the noise. I made the strategy. When he died, I was 58 and had already sat on more boards than most men my age, but the grief was quieter than the success had been. It pressed into me not with despair, but with a terrible kind of stillness. And for a while, I disappeared from everything but the sea. I traveled on Sullivan ships without manifest or purpose. I watched the sunrise from Singapore, the fog roll into Rotterdam. I listened to the creak of hulls against docks and the hum of cranes in distant ports. Grief, I learned, is a kind of tide. It recedes only when you stop trying to outswim it. Then came Charles, a charity auction, a blue dress. I donated anonymously as always. He approached me not with pretense, but with a question. Do you believe in second chances? I did, I still do. That's why I married him. Not for his name, not for his empire, but for the way he looked at me as if he saw something alive, something unruined. He saw Margaret, not the widow, not the billionaire, not the strategy, just me. And in turn, I saw in him a softness rare in men, with power, a yearning to rebuild not just business, but joy. For 3 years, I had lived in this house quietly, modestly, carefully. I wore pearls only on Sundays, never brought my own staff. I used his late wife's teacups, though I preferred heavier porcelain. I gave them everything they could have asked for in a stepmother distance, politeness absence when needed. And still, they gathered behind closed doors and called me a parasite. I suppose every ecosystem has its scavengers, but they forget even scavengers can be protectors. That afternoon, I walked alone to the library, the one room in the house I had made entirely mine. A warm corner of walnut shelves and quiet chairs. Inside a drawer of the writing desk sat a phone. No one in this family knew I had. It rang twice before Jonathan answered. "Margaret," he said, "it's been a while." "Yes," I replied, "but I need your help. Something's changed." I told him what I heard, about Victoria's plan, about Alexander's cold disdain. And then I told him the part that even Charles didn't know yet. "I think it's time," I said. "No more pretending. I want the documents ready." His silence on the line was heavy, but not shocked. "You're sure?" "They've mistaken my silence for permission. I want to remind them I built an empire before I ever stepped foot in this house." Outside, the wind stirred the lavender. Inside, I opened my old notebook, the one I hadn't touched since marrying Charles. It smelled like ink and sea salt and ambition. A quote was written across the front page in Michael's handwriting. "There is no greater power than the one you choose not to use." I traced the words. They thought they were protecting a legacy, but they never asked what I had left behind to be here. They had no idea what I was still capable of. It didn't come all at once. The betrayal, the rejection, the quiet erasure. It came in silences like rain gathering in the corners of a roof before it starts to drip. It came in side glances in chairs not pulled out in family photos where my presence was politely cropped out. It came when I overheard Alexander telling the estate lawyer over speakerphone, "Let's make sure the language is clean. She gets her stipend. Nothing more." My father would want this if he were thinking clearly. He didn't know I was standing in the hallway. Or maybe he did. I stood there with a tray of lemon tea, listening to how they intended to rewrite me out of the story. Victoria, ever precise, added, "We'll present it as a protective move. Dad's been generous, but his judgment is clouded. She has no stake in this family's legacy. Just because she waters the roses doesn't make her an heir." A laugh followed, quiet, ugly. I didn't drop the tray. I didn't speak. But inside, something settled, like dust on untouched furniture. I walked past the door, slowly, deliberately. I made sure they saw me. Neither one said a word. Later that evening, I sat with Charles in the conservatory. He had a newspaper in hand, half read. I watched his eyes trace the lines without absorbing them. His age had softened him, but it hadn't dulled his intelligence. "Your children," I said carefully, "have been very busy." He looked up, sensing the weight of my words. "I overheard them again," I continued. "They're meeting with lawyers to change your will." Charles's face shifted, not surprise, resignation. "I know they don't trust easily," he said, voice low. "But I didn't think they'd do this behind my back." I reached for his hand. "They don't see me, Charles. Not really. They see a stranger occupying their mother's seat. They've written their story, and I'm the antagonist." He turned his palm over and held my fingers in his. Then it's time we tell them the truth. But I wasn't ready, not yet, not until everything was in place. That night, as he slept beside me, I wandered through the house barefoot. Past the piano Elizabeth once played, past the study where Alexander kept his father's old business awards in neat glass cases. I stopped at the photo wall. Frame after frame, smiling children, weddings, graduations. Not one photo of me. Not even from the wedding. They'd never printed one. It wasn't a mistake. It was an omission. And omissions are just a quieter kind of cruelty. I ran my hand along the mantel. The dust was fine. Charles kept the house immaculate. But some things linger, no matter how well you polish them. I went to the linen closet, pulled down the quilt I'd brought from Boston. My mother made it before she passed a patchwork of soft blues and faded whites. It had once covered Rebecca's crib. I unfolded it gently, smoothing the creases. And then I made up the small guest bed in the east wing. Not for anyone else, for me. Because tomorrow I wouldn't sleep in that bed with Charles. Not until he heard everything. Not until I stood fully in the truth of who I was. Not until I knew for certain that love without honesty wasn't enough anymore. The next morning I sat alone in the kitchen eating toast and strawberries. The room smelled like citrus and silence. Catherine entered looking groggy and uncertain. "Margaret," she said, "have you seen Dad? He left early, said he had some business to attend to." She hesitated in the doorway. I heard about the meeting with the lawyer. Alexander said it's just a precaution. Is that what they're calling betrayal now? I asked softly. Catherine flinched. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "You didn't want to know," I corrected gently. "There's a difference." She sat across from me, her hands folded, unsure. "I don't think you're here for money," she said. "I've never thought that." "That doesn't mean you ever defended me." She looked down at her lap. "You're right." We sat there in quiet for a long moment. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the distant cry of crows outside the window. "I want to know more," she finally said. "About you, about before." I smiled, weary. "You will. But not here. Not in this house where every word feels like a negotiation." She nodded. Later that afternoon, Jonathan arrived at the estate. We met in the garden. He brought with him the folder, thick, heavy, bound in leather. I held it in my lap like a weapon disguised in civility. Inside was the truth, all of it, my holdings, my legacy, my life. "I'm ready," I said. "Are you sure?" he asked. I looked toward the house, toward the rooms where my name had never been spoken with warmth. "They want to erase me," I said. "Let's remind them who they tried to forget. Some people fight with fire, some with fury, and some with silence that weighs more than thunder." I had spent a lifetime mastering the latter. The evening before the family meeting, the Hamilton mansion was quiet in a way that felt deceptive, like the calm before a storm that had read the room and decided to wait. Catherine had retreated to her studio. Alexander was nowhere to be seen. Victoria, I suspected, was somewhere plotting in high heels and designer resolve. I was in the library, not reading, not writing, just breathing. The kind of deep, meditative breath you only take when you know something is about to end, or begin. The Sullivan portfolio rested on the table beside me. I hadn't opened it since Jonathan had handed it over. I didn't need to. I knew every figure, every deed, every acquisition. My name was etched into holdings from Oslo to Osaka, but not into a single corner of this house. That contrast used to sting. Now it clarified. I traced the edge of the portfolio. The leather was smooth and dark, like ocean depths where secrets sleep. Upstairs, Charles moved in the bedroom, pacing like a man holding something heavy in his chest. We hadn't spoken since lunch. He knew I had something to share. I knew he wasn't ready yet to hear it. I gave him the gift of silence. And in return, I asked the quiet for one favor: clarity. I lit a candle near the window, something I hadn't done in years. Its flame flickered against the panes, reflecting back a woman I almost didn't recognize. Not because she had changed, but because she had returned to herself. That night, I lay in the East Wing. The quilt from Boston over me, the walls bear the air colder than I remembered. There was a photo on the nightstand. Not of Elizabeth, not of Charles, but of me and Rebecca on a dock in Greece. Wind in our hair, our laughter caught in mid-air like a photograph of freedom. I had left so much of that behind when I married Charles. Not because he asked me to, but because I thought somehow that downplaying myself would make room for the children's grief, that I could earn their acceptance by shrinking my light just enough not to cast shadows. But grief doesn't negotiate, and people rarely make room for what they're determined not to see. I hadn't made them feel safe, because they needed someone beneath them to feel tall, and I had played along, watered their roses, worn their mother's pearls, never once corrected them when they called me Margaret without warmth. But tomorrow the air would change, and when it did, I would not raise my voice. I would raise the truth. At dawn, I dressed deliberately, a navy suit, the color of Sullivan blue. No silk, no sequins, just structure, just presence. I pinned my hair the way Michael used to love it and wore a pearl from my mother's collection, just one at the throat. A quiet reminder. Downstairs, the staff had already begun preparing the cars. The meeting was in the city. Charles found me in the sunroom. He paused at the sight of me. I saw the flicker in his eyes, recognition, realization, maybe even awe. "I've never seen you in that suit," he said. "I haven't needed it," I replied, "until now." He crossed the room and took my hand. "Margaret, before we go, I need to ask, what is it you're about to do?" I met his gaze. "I'm not going to fight them. I'm going to show them the truth." He searched my face. "Why now?" I took a breath. "Because silence is not submission, it's patience, and mine has run its course." He nodded. "Do you want me to defend you?" "No," I said softly, "just don't stop me." The ride to the Hamilton headquarters was short, but it felt long. The city rose up around us, glass towers and morning sun. I watched it all pass through the window like memories I hadn't decided whether to keep. When we arrived, Charles stepped out first, then me. Jonathan was already there, waiting near the entrance, portfolio in hand. He gave me a quiet nod. I returned it. Inside the boardroom was already filling. Catherine composed, Alexander stiff, Victoria radiant with ambition and concealed contempt. They hadn't seen me yet. Not like this. I took my seat beside Charles, unfolded my hands, watched, listened, and waited. The room was quiet, the air tight. The storm was almost here, but I wasn't afraid. I had been quiet long enough. The hum of the air conditioning in the Hamilton boardroom was the only sound as Charles cleared his throat and gently tapped his knuckles against the polished table. "Before we begin today's review," he said with quiet authority, "I'd like to offer the floor to someone whose voice has been absent for far too long. My wife, Margaret." Victoria blinked. Catherine froze her pen, stilled above her notepad. Alexander's brow lifted a flicker of irritation barely disguised. I stood, slowly. No rustling of notes, no flurry of papers, just my hands unfolding my breath, measured the Sullivan portfolio resting beside me like a truth long buried, but never lost. I looked out across the table not as a woman seeking approval, but as one who had already reclaimed something sacred, her self-respect. "Thank you, Charles," I said, voice even. "I won't take long." And yet, I knew what I was about to say would echo through the Hamilton family long after the words left my mouth. For 3 years, I have been called many things. Not to my face, of course. That would be impolite. But I've heard them nonetheless. My eyes rested briefly on Victoria, then Alexander. Gold digger, parasite, widow clinging to legacy that isn't hers. Victoria's jaw clenched. I have tolerated these assumptions, not because they didn't wound me, but because I believed that with enough patience, enough grace, perhaps they would fade, that perhaps in time I would be seen. I paused. The room was still. Even the hum of the HVAC seemed quieter. But I have realized something: silence is not always virtuous. Sometimes it only reinforces the stories others want to tell about you. I opened the portfolio, lifted a single sheet. "My name is Margaret Elizabeth Sullivan." Alexander frowned, recognition sparking. Catherine's head tilted slightly. "Sullivan," I repeated. As in Sullivan Shipping, as in one of the largest privately held maritime logistics enterprises in the world. I slid the documents across the table. Jonathan followed, handing each person a folder. I married Michael Sullivan when I was 22. We built the company together over 40 years. After his passing, I became the sole shareholder chairwoman and steward of the Sullivan legacy. Alexander's lips parted. Victoria stared at the figures in the documents, then at me, then back again. I did not hide this to deceive you, I continued. I withheld it because I have spent a lifetime being pursued not for who I am, but for what I represent. When I met Charles, he didn't know my name. He saw me. That alone was a miracle. I looked directly at Victoria. But I will not be erased by a family that never once asked who I had been before I crossed this threshold. I will not be amended out of a man's will like a miscalculation on a spreadsheet. Charles reached over and took my hand. His grip was strong, steady. You thought I wanted the Hamilton fortune, I said. What you never imagined was that it is dwarfed many times over by the wealth I never mentioned. The room was stunned. Catherine was the first to speak. You're the Margaret Sullivan from the Forbes article in 2015, the anonymous philanthropist behind the Atlantic Literacy Trust. I nodded, among other things. A pause. Then, Victoria stood, slowly. She placed her folder on the table as if it had burned her fingers. This changes nothing, she said tight-lipped. You still didn't belong in our mother's house. You still replaced her. I held her gaze. No one can replace the dead Victoria, but you have mistaken grief for entitlement. That house is not a shrine. It is a home, and I have honored it every day I've lived there, even while being treated as an intruder. Alexander stayed seated, but his voice was low and sharp. You manipulated us. No, I replied. I allowed you to reveal who you are when you believe someone has no power. Catherine looked between us. So what happens now? Now. That word felt like breath. I reached into the folder and pulled out one final document. A proposal, I said, for a collaboration between Sullivan Shipping and Hamilton Industries. Not a handout, not a punishment, a partnership. Eyes widened again. Even Victoria couldn't hide her surprise. Because I don't want revenge. I want respect. And maybe, just maybe, I want to believe that families, no matter how broken, can be rebuilt. Charles placed his hand gently on my shoulder. Margaret has honored this family more than you know. It's time we do the same. The room didn't explode. No dramatic shouting, no storming out. Just silence. The stunned, soft silence that follows a long overdue truth. And in that silence, I felt something shift. Not loudly, not all at once, but undeniably. That night, I walked alone into the garden, the early autumn air brushing past my skin like a benediction. The fountain murmured nearby. The roses stood taller than I remembered. I stood beneath the arbor where Charles had kissed me the first time after our wedding and exhaled. The first shift had happened. Not because I demanded it, but because I stopped waiting for permission. I had taken up space, spoken my name, claimed my truth, and for the first time in 3 years, they had listened. The day after the boardroom reckoning, the mansion was different, still beautiful, still vast, but somehow smaller, as if the walls themselves had pulled inward to whisper, "She changed everything." Victoria didn't speak to me. She avoided breakfast. Her heels clicked against the marble like punctuation marks to a letter I hadn't written. Alexander left early, claiming meetings. Charles lingered longer than usual by the sunroom windows, lost in thought. But Catherine, she found me in the garden. "May I sit?" she asked. I nodded, motioning to the bench beside the fountain, my bench. "I want to understand it all," she said, her voice careful. "I read every page of that portfolio. It's staggering." "Numbers are just stories," I replied. "You learn to read between the lines, you find the truth." She looked at me, really looked, and I saw a shift in her eyes. Less suspicion, more curiosity, maybe even admiration. "Why now?" she asked. "Why reveal this now after years of enduring?" I offered. She winced. "Yes." I paused, letting the breeze settle between us, because I believed love would be enough. That grace would make space where grief had closed doors. But when they tried to write me out of the will, erase me like a mistake, I realized that silence had become complicity. Catherine nodded slowly, her fingers fidgeting with the sleeve of her sweater. "And now," I said gently, "I move forward. On my terms." That evening, Jonathan returned. We met in a discreet cafe tucked between brick alleyways in the old quarter of the city. He placed a sleek portfolio on the table, as requested. Inside, legal documentation reaffirming my holdings, a complete net worth statement, letters of intent for potential Sullivan-Hamilton joint ventures, a personal letter to Charles to be opened only if I chose to walk away. I touched the envelope but didn't lift it. "Do you want this?" Jonathan asked. "A clean exit." "No," I replied, "but I want the option, because staying should never be the result of being cornered." He nodded. "Then there's one more thing." He pulled out a second envelope, cream thick, sealed with red wax. "What's this?" "A letter of appointment. Should you ever wish to designate Rebecca as CEO and step back formally. Signed, witnessed, quietly registered." I looked at him. "You planned ahead. I've known you long enough, Margaret. You don't move without layers." I smiled, the kind that carries 20 years of storms weathered. "Thank you." When I returned home, Charles was waiting in the library. "I know what you're doing," he said without accusation. "I'm preparing," I replied, "not for war, for dignity." He poured me a glass of wine, handed it to me without a word. "You always knew, didn't you?" I asked. He sipped his drink, then met my gaze. I suspected, but I loved the version of you that chose not to lead with it. That told me more than numbers ever could. I nodded, feeling the quiet hum of mutual respect rise between us again. "Then you understand why I need to do this, why I need to have my name, not yours, not theirs, written into the truth of what comes next." "Of course," he said. The next morning, I walked into my old study, the one I'd used for gardening notes and donation letters. Now I opened my laptop, signed into my secure Sullivan terminal, reviewed reports, answered messages, scheduled a private flight for Rebecca to join me next week. And then I composed a message. Subject line, "To the Hamiltons, a proposal for the future recipients, Victoria, Alexander, Catherine Attachments, Sullivan-Hamilton Synergy Deck, Sullivan Foundation Expansion Plan, Personal Statement." It wasn't a declaration of power. It was a blueprint for healing, for truth, for a future built not on illusion or hierarchy, but on mutual respect. Before I hit send, I read the final paragraph aloud to myself. "I married your father because I loved him, not because I lacked. I stayed silent, not because I was small, but because I believed the quiet could teach more than confrontation. Now I offer you a path forward, not one that demands forgiveness or forced affection, but one that begins with acknowledgement. I am not a placeholder. I am not a burden. I am a woman with her own history, and I have invited yours to meet mine." I hit send, and for the first time in years, I stood, not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as Margaret Sullivan Hamilton. The name they would remember, whether they wanted to or not. There are moments in life when the air becomes thick, not from weather, but from waiting. The kind of pause that happens when something long denied finally demands a name. That morning, I found Charles in the conservatory. His cane rested beside him, unused, a relic from an older pain. He was reading or pretending to, but I saw it in his eyes the way people look just before they confess or collapse. "Margaret," he said, folding the paper, but not rising. "They've asked for a meeting. Just the children, no lawyers." I knew it was coming. This wasn't strategy. This was emotional combat. When I asked, "Tonight, 8, the sunroom." Of course, the sunroom, where light always looked soft even when truth didn't. At 7:58, I walked in. Not late, not early. Just enough to remind them I wasn't waiting anymore. Victoria stood by the mantel. Alexander near the window, arms crossed. Catherine was already seated, nervously tracing the rim of her teacup. Charles excused himself quietly. It was never going to be his battle to fight. I sat across from them, straight spine, unfolded hands, every part of me still and measured. Alexander was first. "You blindsided us." I tilted my head slightly. "I gave you the dignity of seeing me for who I am. That's not a betrayal. That's a correction." Victoria leaned forward sharp. "You humiliated us. In front of the board. In front of Dad." "No," I said. "You did that. I just stopped letting you write the script." Catherine cut in. Voice calm but strained. Can we just talk without the fire? But the fire was already here, and it had been burning quietly for years. I turned to Victoria. Tell me, what did you imagine I was after all this time? She didn't blink. His money, his legacy. I offered a small, sorrowful smile. That's because you've only ever known how to inherit power, not build it. Her face went pale. I built something from nothing. I continued. Twice. I walked through grief, through boardrooms that never welcomed women, through decades of being underestimated, and I never once asked anyone to hand me a throne. I carved my own table. Alexander scoffed. Then why marry into ours? I turned to him. Because even strong women want love, but I never married for a crown. I brought my own. Silence, thick and breathing. Then Catherine asked the question none of them had dared voice. Why didn't you ever tell us? I looked at her softer now. Because grief is greedy. And I thought if I came in quietly, gently, you might let me stay. I didn't want to replace your mother. I wanted to belong beside the memory of her. Victoria's voice cracked. But you did. You took her place. I looked down. My voice gentled. No, Victoria. You gave it away. Not because of me, but because you kept waiting for her to walk back in. That silenced her more than anything else I'd said. Then I pulled out one more folder, smaller, simpler. Here, I said, sliding it across the table, my counterproposal. Alexander opened it, his eyebrows lifted. You want to fund the Hamilton Foundation's literacy initiative. I nodded, fully, with Sullivan Resources. Under one condition, I help co-lead the board for the first 3 years. No power struggle, no puppetry, partnership. Catherine's eyes filled, but she didn't blink them away. You're giving us this. I'm investing in the only part of this family that hasn't tried to erase me the future. Victoria looked at me then, not with warmth, but with something heavier. Respect, maybe, or reluctant awe. And what do you get? She asked. I looked around the room. The portraits, the silence, the spaces where Elizabeth still lingered like perfume. I get to walk into a room and not be mistaken for a guest. The meeting ended without applause. No handshakes, no teary hugs. But when I stood, no one interrupted me. When I walked out, no one turned their back. It was the beginning of something. Not peace, not yet, but acknowledgement. And for now, that was enough. Later that night, I stood in the garden. Charles joined me quiet. How did it go? He asked. They didn't embrace me, I said, but they didn't deny me either. He took my hand. You changed everything. No, I replied. I just reminded them that I was never nothing to begin with. The moon was high, the roses were sleeping, and the woman once mistaken for decoration had become the architect of the next chapter. 3 weeks passed, long enough for silence to settle again, but not the same silence as before. This one was full, not empty. The kind of quiet that happens when people are learning how to listen. Rebecca arrived on a Thursday afternoon. She stepped off the private jet in low heels and a navy blue coat, her presence as calm and unshakable as the tide. I hadn't seen her in person in nearly 2 years. Work, distance, life. But now with one phone call, she'd come. No questions, no hesitation. Mom, she whispered, pulling me into an embrace that collapsed the miles between us. We didn't speak for a long moment. Our hug said more than any explanation ever could. She'd always known, always sensed when I was shrinking for someone else's comfort, and she never once asked me to. That evening I hosted a dinner, just family. No lawyers, no documents, no quiet agenda beneath the plates. Catherine arrived first, then Alexander, then late but not absent Victoria. She didn't wear armor this time. No sharp collars, no pointed shoes, just a soft gray sweater and an expression somewhere between curiosity and fatigue. Rebecca greeted each of them with poise, with grace, but no pretenses. I've heard a lot about you, she said to Catherine. I hope not too much, Catherine replied with a shy smile. We sat at the long table, the one Elizabeth used to decorate with sunflowers. Tonight, I placed wild jasmine instead, because some things deserve to grow freely. Halfway through the meal, Alexander cleared his throat. This feels different, he said. It is, I replied, because no one here is pretending anymore. Victoria reached for her wine glass, then set it down. She looked at me. You've changed this house, she said. No, I answered. The house is the same. What's changed is the way I stand inside it. She stared at me, then almost imperceptibly nodded. Rebecca spoke next. I was raised by a woman who built empires and still left room at the table for everyone. She doesn't demand love, she offers it. But she will never again beg for a seat she earned. Her words landed like gentle rain, soft but impossible to ignore. After dinner, I led them to the study. There on the wall where Elizabeth's portrait once hung was something new. Not a replacement, a companion piece. A hand-drawn image, charcoal on linen. 2 women, back to back. One with pearls, one with a garden spade. Different eras, same strength. Victoria stared at it, then at me. You had this commissioned... No, I said, Catherine did. Victoria turned, startled. I found Mom's old sketchbooks, Catherine said quietly. She used to draw women like this, ordinary, powerful. I just finished it. For the first time in years, tears welled up in Victoria's eyes. Not from grief, from something deeper, recognition. I didn't think I'd ever be able to see her beside you, she whispered. You didn't have to, I replied. You only had to see me. That night, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt held. Not by one woman's memory or another's silence, but by something larger than both. Legacy chosen, not inherited. Charles joined me on the balcony as the evening cooled. She would have liked this, he said, looking at the portrait. She would have laughed at how long it took, I added. And we stood there, 2 people no longer afraid to say what had been missing. I wasn't a replacement. I was a continuation, not of Elizabeth, but of love itself. The kind that survives, adapts, and when necessary, redefines everything. Some restorations are loud trumpets, applause, headlines, but the ones that matter most are quiet. So quiet you almost miss them, unless you're listening for them. Weeks passed. The house settled into something gentler, the kind of rhythm a home finds when its walls no longer need to defend themselves. Victoria still kept her distance, but not from contempt, from reflection. Sometimes we crossed paths in the hallway, no glares, just nods, a kind of peace treaty in passing. Alexander surprised me one afternoon. He found me in the East Wing where I still kept my quiet corner of the world. I wanted to show you something, he said. He handed me a leather-bound proposal, neat, precise. It was a plan to restructure Hamilton Industries' family trust, not to exclude anyone, but to include new names. Mine, Rebecca's, even a nod to the Sullivan Foundation. This doesn't fix everything, he admitted, but maybe it's a start. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just placed a hand on the folder and said, then let's begin. Rebecca extended her trip. She hosted 2 workshops at the local university, spoke on sustainable logistics, leadership ethics, and how to run a company without losing your soul. Catherine attended both sessions, took notes, asked questions. Later that week, I walked into the sunroom and found them laughing, sharing stories, planning a joint initiative to bring vocational training to underserved youth. I didn't interrupt. I just stood at the threshold and let the warmth of that moment settle deep in my bones. This was the restoration, not just of reputation, not just of name, but of possibility. Charles, too, changed in small but profound ways. He took fewer meetings, spent more mornings in the garden, began writing again, something he hadn't done since Elizabeth died. One afternoon, he handed me a short essay. It was titled, The Women Who Made Me Better. He'd written about Elizabeth, about Catherine, about his own mother, and then about me. He called me the storm I didn't know I needed, the silence that spoke louder than legacy, the love that made me look inward instead of backward. I folded the paper gently, pressed it to my chest. He didn't need to say anything more. One morning, I woke before sunrise and wandered through the house barefoot. I passed the family photo wall. It had changed. New frames had been added, not to replace the old, to grow beside them. There I was smiling beside Charles at a Hamilton Foundation event. There was Rebecca and Catherine with their sleeves rolled up at a community garden. Even Victoria standing in front of a school library plaque that bore our shared names. And in the center, a quote carved into wood. Legacy is not what we leave behind. It's what we choose to build together. I returned to the garden, my hands in the soil, knees in the earth. Charles watched from the balcony. Rebecca brought tea. Catherine brought cuttings for transplant. Victoria didn't come out, but from the window she watched. And that was enough. For now. Because healing doesn't always arrive with open arms. Sometimes it starts with open eyes. And I, the woman they once tried to write out, was now the quiet author of a new beginning. There are endings that feel like doors closing. And there are endings that feel like hands opening, making space for something else to begin. This was the latter. 1 year later. The Hamilton mansion looked nearly the same. Same windows, same hallways, same quiet echo when you walked the east wing too early in the morning. But the feeling of the place had changed. It no longer asked for permission to breathe. It no longer held its breath, waiting for Elizabeth. Her memory had settled, not erased, not replaced, but finally, respected. That spring, we opened the doors of the new Hamilton Sullivan Learning Center. It stood on the same plot where the Hamiltons once considered building another corporate tower. Instead, now it would house books, light voices of children who never knew legacy the way we did. They would write their own. Catherine was the director. Rebecca served as chair of the advisory board. And Victoria donated the first shipment of books, silently. Without a speech, but with a small handwritten note tucked inside the dedication copy. For the woman who taught me strength didn't have to shout. I never told anyone she'd written that. Some things are meant to be held privately, like forgiveness, like grace. Charles passed that fall, not suddenly, not painfully. He left this world as he lived in his last year gently. We buried him beside Elizabeth as he'd asked. And beside her, we left a rose, one from the garden I had restored. A symbol not of rivalry, but of continuation. In his will, he left me everything. Not because I asked, but because he finally saw that I had never taken anything from him, only added to what already was. Some nights I still walk the halls barefoot, not because I feel like a ghost, but because I've made peace with the ones who no longer walk beside me. I stop by the study, the portrait wall, the garden, and I say their names. Not out loud, just in my heart. Elizabeth, Charles, Michael. Not a single one erased, each one a chapter, each one folded into me. I no longer need rooms full of people to know I belong. I no longer need a title to know who I am. Because now I live in the quiet power of presence. The foundation thrives. The family, though still imperfect, calls. Catherine sends letters. Alexander visits with his daughter. Victoria, still guarded, still growing, invites me to tea. And Rebecca now calls this place home. She laughs here. She writes here. She plants things beside me in the earth and never asks me to explain who I was because she already knows. I often say to her, legacy is not built in boardrooms. And she finishes it for me. It's built in the moments when you decide to stay standing. So this is where I'll stay. Not because I was chosen, but because I chose. Not as someone's second, not as someone's mistake, not even as someone's redemption, but as Margaret Sullivan Hamilton, the woman who stayed silent long enough for them to hear her, and then spoke not to conquer, but to restore.